Today, we are going to look at the most horrifying snake attacks ever recorded on camera, from an overconfident snake breeder that got attacked by a defensive python, to a researcher that got bitten by a copperhead after getting distracted.
The evening of June 15, 2014 brought oppressive humidity to Gainesville, Florida, with temperatures still hovering near 85 degrees even as the sun began to set. The thick, sweltering air made even routine tasks feel more laborious, and the climate-controlled reptile facilities offered welcome relief from the stifling heat outside. Robert Bob Hendricks was conducting his routine evening feeding at his specialized python facility, taking advantage of the cooler evening hours when his animals were most active. At 43, Bob had built an impeccable reputation over 18 years of breeding large constrictors, supplying his specimens to zoos and research facilities across the Southeast. His colleagues knew him for his meticulous safety protocols and deep understanding of giant snake behavior. He had never had a serious incident in his entire career. At 9:45 p.m., Bob was preparing to feed his most impressive specimen, an 18-foot, 180-pound female Burmese python he had raised from a hatchling over 8 years. These serpents represent the pinnacle of constrictor evolution, capable of growing over 20 feet in length and weighing more than 200 pounds in exceptional cases. Burmese pythons are among the most powerful constrictors in the world, with muscular bodies perfectly designed for overpowering large prey through sheer crushing force. The Burmese python's hunting strategy is a masterpiece of predatory efficiency. These massive snakes are ambush predators that can remain motionless for days while waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. Their heat-sensing abilities allow them to detect warm-blooded prey from remarkable distances, while their incredible strength enables them to overpower animals as large as deer, wild boar, and even alligators in their native Southeast Asia habitat. When a Burmese python strikes, the attack is devastatingly effective. They don't just constrict around their prey, they position their coils with mechanical precision, applying pressure that can exceed 90 pounds per square inch. These apex predators possess incredible strength that allows them to overpower prey much larger than themselves. A large Burmese python can exert enough constricting force to crush bones and compress vital organs, while their stamina allows them to maintain this pressure for extended periods. Their feeding response, once triggered, is relentless and methodical. They will not release their grip until they are certain their prey is completely subdued. This particular female was in peak condition, her body thick and muscular from years of proper care and feeding. She had been fasting for 4 weeks in preparation for breeding season, making her extremely food-motivated and responsive to feeding cues. Well-conditioned Burmese pythons in feeding mode are among the most dangerous animals to work with, as their predatory instincts are heightened and their strike response is lightning fast. Bob had been preparing to feed her a large rabbit using his standard safety protocols, feeding tongs, secure barriers, and maintaining safe distances at all times. However, as he maneuvered the prey item toward the feeding chamber, the rabbit slipped from his tongs and landed just inside the enclosure opening. Instead of using backup tongs or waiting for the snake to settle, Bob made a split-second decision that violated his own safety rules. Believing he could quickly retrieve the rabbit before the python could react, Bob reached into the enclosure with his bare hand. The moment his arm crossed the threshold, the python's predatory instincts were triggered. The massive python struck with explosive speed, her jaws clamping down on Bob's forearm with crushing force. Her backward curved teeth, each nearly an inch long, sank deep into his flesh and locked him in place. Before Bob could react or call for help, 180 pounds of pure muscle began wrapping around his arm and torso with mechanical precision. The snake's primitive brain had identified him as a threat or potential prey, and her constricting response was now fully activated. Each time Bob struggled or tried to pull away, the python's grip tightened automatically, her powerful muscles responding to his movements by increasing pressure. Bob's attempts to call for help were cut short as the python's grip tightened around his chest, making it impossible to draw a full breath. The snake's muscular coils responded to his struggles by constricting further. Each movement he made triggered an even tighter grip. His ribs began to compress under the tremendous force, and his vision started to darken as oxygen deprivation took hold. The constriction was methodical and relentless. Bob's consciousness faded as the python's coils compressed his chest and restricted blood flow to his brain. The snake maintained her grip for over 17 minutes after he stopped moving, her primitive instincts ensuring that her perceived prey was completely neutralized. Only when she was certain there was no threat did she begin to slowly release her coils and retreat to the back of her enclosure. Bob's assistant found him the next morning when she arrived for the daily feeding rounds. The python was coiled peacefully in her favorite hiding spot, showing no signs of agitation or stress. Bob's body bore the unmistakable marks of constriction, compressed ribs, restricted breathing passages, and the deep puncture wounds where the snake's teeth had initially grabbed him. The investigation revealed that Bob had violated multiple safety protocols in his attempt to quickly retrieve the dropped prey item. His death served as a stark reminder that large constrictors, regardless of their normal temperament or years of conditioning, remain powerful predators whose instincts can be triggered by the slightest provocation during feeding situations. But while Bob's incident involved one of the world's most powerful constrictors, another breeder was about to discover that even seemingly docile species can become deadly under the wrong circumstances, proving that in the world of reptile keeping, danger can come from the most unexpected sources. March 8, 2016 dawned clear and warm in Phoenix, Arizona, with temperatures climbing toward a pleasant 78 degrees by evening. The desert air was dry and still, creating perfect conditions for the large constrictors that thrived in Marcus Chen's converted garage facility. Marcus Chen was preparing to feed his largest snake at his home-based breeding operation, taking advantage of the mild evening weather that kept his facility at optimal temperatures. The 31-year-old had spent 8 years specializing in large constrictors and was well known in the reptile community for producing exceptional reticulated pythons. Marcus lived alone and often worked with the snakes during evening hours, a practice that would prove fatal. The converted garage facility where Marcus housed his collection was a marvel of reptile husbandry engineering. Custom-built enclosures provided adequate space for his largest specimens, while sophisticated climate control systems maintained the tropical conditions these Southeast Asian natives required. Marcus had invested heavily in security systems, both to protect his valuable animals and to ensure they couldn't escape. Marcus had acquired his prized reticulated python through a specialized reptile dealer who imported Southeast Asian species for serious collectors. The snake had been legally imported as a juvenile and required special permits. At 7:20 p.m., Marcus approached the enclosure housing his most impressive specimen, an 18-foot, 140-pound female reticulated python he had raised from a hatchling over the past 6 years. These serpents are among nature's most efficient predators, capable of growing over 30 feet in length and weighing more than 250 pounds in the wild. Reticulated pythons are ambush hunters that kill through constriction, wrapping their muscular bodies around prey and applying pressure that can exceed 90 pounds per square inch. The reticulated python's hunting strategy is a masterpiece of evolutionary engineering. These snakes possess incredibly sensitive heat-detecting organs that can locate warm-blooded prey from considerable distances. Their muscular bodies are perfectly designed for constriction, with hundreds of ribs providing anchor points for the powerful muscles that generate the crushing force. When constricting, these pythons don't crush their victims as commonly believed. Instead, they prevent breathing by tightening their coils each time the prey exhales, eventually causing cardiac arrest through oxygen deprivation. The process is remarkably efficient, with the snake able to detect the victim's heartbeat and breathing patterns through sensitive receptors along its body. Their incredible strength allows them to overpower animals as large as deer, wild boar, and even small crocodiles in their native Southeast Asia habitat. The python's heat-sensing abilities and lightning-fast reflexes make them nearly impossible to escape from once they've initiated an attack. Their strike speed can exceed 12 miles per hour, and their ability to accurately target warm-blooded animals in complete darkness makes them formidable predators. This particular female was in pre-shed condition, making her nearly blind and extremely defensive. Snakes preparing to shed their skin experience a condition called opaque or blue phase, where their eyes become clouded with a milky film and their vision is severely impaired. During this time, snakes become increasingly defensive and unpredictable, as their reduced vision makes them perceive any movement as a potential threat. Marcus made a critical decision that violated basic safety protocols. Instead of waiting for her to complete the shedding process or using proper feeding protocols from outside the enclosure, he entered her cage directly. This decision went against everything he had learned about large constrictor safety and contradicted the advice he regularly gave to other keepers. The moment Marcus stepped into the enclosure, the python struck defensively, grabbing his shoulder and immediately beginning to constrict. Her defensive response was instantaneous and overwhelming. 140 pounds of pure muscle wrapping around Marcus's torso with crushing force. The python's coils positioned themselves with deadly precision. One loop around his chest, another around his neck, effectively cutting off his ability to breathe or call for help. Marcus's phone was in his pocket, but the constricting pressure prevented him from reaching it or making any coordinated movements. The python's grip tightened with each of his attempts to struggle, her powerful muscles responding to his movements by increasing pressure. The snake's primitive brain had identified him as a threat to be neutralized, and her instincts demanded she maintain her grip until the perceived danger was eliminated. His neighbor found him the following evening when Marcus failed to answer repeated calls about a scheduled reptile pickup. The python had to be carefully removed by experienced animal control officers who understood the delicate process of unwrapping a constrictor without causing further harm. The incident became a rallying cry for enhanced safety protocols when working with large constrictors. This tragedy demonstrated the critical importance of never entering large constrictor enclosures and always having safety backup when working alone. Marcus's death served as a sobering reminder that even the most experienced keepers can make fatal errors in judgment, and that large constrictors, regardless of their normal temperament, remain powerful predators capable of killing humans. But while Marcus's death showed the lethal power of large snakes, another case was developing in Texas, where even the gentlest species would prove dangerous under unexpected circumstances. April 22, 2017 brought perfect spring weather to San Antonio, Texas, with clear skies and mild temperatures in the mid-70s creating ideal conditions for working with reptiles. The pleasant morning air made it comfortable to work in the facility without relying heavily on climate control systems. James Jimmy Rodriguez was photographing snakes at his commercial breeding facility, Lone Star Pythons, taking advantage of the excellent natural lighting that the clear morning provided. At 38, Jimmy ran one of Texas's largest ball python breeding operations and was respected throughout the reptile community for his genetic work with rare morphs. He had a history of minor heart problems, but managed them with medication and maintained an active lifestyle. Jimmy was known for his expertise with ball pythons, a species considered among the safest large snakes to handle due to their docile temperament. His facility housed hundreds of snakes, and he had been successfully breeding pythons for 12 years without serious incident. The commercial success of Lone Star pythons had allowed Jimmy to expand his operation significantly over the years, growing from a hobby into a full-time business. At 6:30 a.m., Jimmy was photographing a valuable adult male ball python for online sales, part of his regular routine for marketing his animals to collectors worldwide. The 6-foot specimen represented the gentle nature that made ball pythons popular in the pet trade. Native to West and Central Africa, ball pythons are non-venomous constrictors that typically grow 3 to 5 feet in length, though exceptional specimens like this one can reach 6 feet. They're called ball pythons because of their tendency to curl into a tight ball when threatened, with their head protected in the center of their coiled body. Unlike their larger reticulated cousins, ball pythons are known for their calm demeanor and reluctance to bite. They're primarily nocturnal creatures that spend much of their time hiding in burrows or termite mounds in their native African habitat. When ball pythons do constrict, it's typically a gentle pressure compared to larger python species. However, they still possess the fundamental constricting instincts of all pythons. When they feel threatened or sense instability, they will wrap around whatever they perceive as secure and tighten their grip. Jimmy suddenly experienced crushing chest pain and shortness of breath, the unmistakable onset of a massive heart attack. The cardiac event struck without warning, sending waves of agony through his torso as his cardiovascular system began to fail. His breathing became labored and erratic as he collapsed to the floor, his body convulsing with the pain and stress of the medical emergency. As Jimmy collapsed, the python was still draped around his neck and torso in the relaxed position typical of calm ball pythons during handling. The snake, sensing Jimmy's sudden distress through his rapid heartbeat, irregular breathing, and the stress hormones flooding his system, immediately shifted from its relaxed state to defensive mode. The python's response was purely instinctual. When ball pythons feel threatened or sense that their environment has become unstable, they seek security by wrapping around whatever seems most stable. Under normal circumstances, Jimmy could have easily removed the docile snake with minimal effort. However, Jimmy's weakened state from the cardiac arrest prevented him from performing even these simple movements. The combination of the heart attack and the snake's natural constricting response created a deadly situation that neither Jimmy nor the python could have anticipated. Jimmy's assistant found him 3 hours later when arriving for the morning shift. The snake was still wrapped around him, not from aggression but from defensive instinct triggered by Jimmy's medical emergency. Despite immediate medical attention, the combination of cardiac distress and restricted breathing had proven fatal. The incident led to new recommendations for buddy systems in reptile facilities and highlighted the importance of having immediate backup when working with any constricting species, regardless of temperament. The tragedy demonstrated that even the most docile snakes could become inadvertently dangerous when their handlers experience medical emergencies. But while Jimmy's death was a tragic convergence of medical emergency and animal behavior, another case in Arizona would reveal an entirely different kind of hidden danger. August 11, 2015 brought scorching heat to Tucson, Arizona, with temperatures soaring past 110 degrees by mid-afternoon. The desert sun beat down mercilessly, making the climate-controlled research facility a welcome refuge from the brutal heat outside. Dr. Patricia Pat Williams was conducting routine maintenance at her private research facility, grateful for the air conditioning that kept her workspace at a comfortable temperature while the desert baked outside. At 45, Dr. Williams held a PhD in herpetology and operated a licensed facility that bred native venomous snakes for educational purposes. She had been working with venomous species for 15 years and was considered an expert on southwestern reptiles. She had been bitten twice before during her career, both times by copperheads, with minimal effects beyond standard localized symptoms. These previous incidents had followed typical patterns for copperhead envenomation: localized pain, swelling, and tissue damage that resolved with appropriate medical treatment. Her experience with these bites had given her confidence in her ability to handle copperhead encounters. At 2:15 p.m., while cleaning a copperhead enclosure, Pat was working with one of North America's most common venomous snakes. Copperheads are medium-sized pit vipers, typically growing 2 to 3 feet in length, with distinctive hourglass-shaped crossbands across their copper-colored bodies that provide excellent camouflage in their natural leaf litter habitat. They're found throughout the eastern United States and are responsible for more venomous snake bites than any other North American species, primarily because of their wide distribution and tendency to freeze when threatened rather than flee. The copperhead's defensive strategy is based on camouflage rather than aggression. These snakes have evolved coloration and patterns that make them nearly invisible when lying motionless among fallen leaves and forest debris. When threatened, copperheads typically remain perfectly still, relying on their camouflage to avoid detection. Copperhead venom is considered relatively mild compared to other pit vipers, like rattlesnakes or cottonmouths. Their venom is primarily hemotoxic, containing enzymes that break down blood cells and tissue, causing localized damage, swelling, and pain. However, fatalities from copperhead bites are extremely rare in healthy adults, with most bites resulting in localized symptoms that resolve with proper medical treatment. The species is also known for dry bites, defensive strikes where little or no venom is injected, which occur in approximately 25% of copperhead encounters. These snakes are ambush predators that rely on their excellent camouflage to remain hidden while waiting for prey. Their heat-sensing pit organs can detect warm-blooded animals from several feet away, allowing them to strike with remarkable accuracy even in complete darkness. Copperheads are generally docile and prefer to remain motionless when humans approach, relying on their camouflage rather than aggressive behavior. They typically strike only when directly threatened, stepped on, or handled. And even then, many strikes are defensive warnings rather than serious attempts to inject venom. Pat was bitten on the hand when she momentarily lost focus during a phone call with a colleague about an upcoming research project. The copperhead's defensive strike was typical for the species, a quick bite and immediate release, more of a warning than a serious attack. The bite itself seemed almost insignificant at first, 2 small puncture wounds that barely bled, typical of a copperhead's relatively small fangs. However, this bite triggered an unprecedented reaction that Dr. Williams had never experienced before. Within minutes of the bite, she began experiencing symptoms that had nothing to do with the snake's venom. Her throat began to tighten, her breathing became labored, and hives erupted across her skin in a pattern consistent with severe allergic reaction. Years of exposure to snake proteins through handling, feeding, and research activities had sensitized her immune system without her knowledge. The allergic reaction developed with terrifying speed, overwhelming her body's normal responses to the relatively mild copperhead venom. Her airways began to close as histamines flooded her system, while her blood pressure dropped precipitously as her cardiovascular system went into shock. The familiar symptoms of copperhead envenomation were completely overshadowed by the life-threatening allergic response. Dr. Williams recognized the signs of anaphylaxis immediately and managed to administer her EpiPen while calling 911. Her scientific training allowed her to understand what was happening to her body, but the dual crisis of envenomation and allergic reaction created a medical emergency that went far beyond standard treatment protocols. The copperhead's venom, while mild by pit viper standards, began causing tissue damage and localized bleeding at the bite site. Simultaneously, the allergic reaction attacked her respiratory and cardiovascular systems, creating a cascade of complications that her body couldn't manage. Her airways continued to constrict despite the epinephrine, while the venom's anticoagulant properties interfered with her body's ability to clot properly. Dr. Williams died en route to the hospital, becoming the first documented case of fatal anaphylaxis triggered by a copperhead envenomation. Her death shocked the herpetological community and led to new recommendations for allergy testing among long-term reptile handlers. The tragedy revealed that even experienced professionals could develop hidden sensitivities to the animals they'd worked with safely for years. But while Pat's death revealed hidden medical risks that had developed over years of exposure, the final case in our series would prove that sometimes the greatest danger comes not from the snakes themselves, but from the very equipment meant to protect them during emergencies. December 3rd, 2013 brought the worst ice storm in decades to the mountains of North Carolina, with freezing rain coating everything in a treacherous layer of ice. By evening, temperatures had plummeted to well below freezing, and the rural areas around Asheville were locked in a crystalline grip that snapped power lines and left thousands without electricity. Snake Steve Morrison was dealing with the severe power outage at his rural breeding facility, watching nervously as the temperature continued to drop, and his backup heating system strained against the bitter cold. At 52, Steve had been breeding native venomous species for 22 years, supplying educational institutions and zoos throughout the Southeast with specimens for research and educational programs. He was considered an expert on southeastern venomous snakes and lived alone on his remote mountain property. Steve had invested heavily in backup systems to protect his animals during emergencies, understanding the critical nature of maintaining proper temperatures for his cold-blooded charges. His facility included backup generators, battery-powered heating systems, and emergency protocols designed to keep his animals alive during power outages and other emergencies. During the ice storm that knocked out power, Steve brought a small generator into his attached garage to power essential heating systems for his snakes. The decision seemed logical. His animals' lives depended on maintaining proper temperatures, and the generator could provide the necessary electricity to keep critical heating systems running. However, Steve underestimated the ventilation requirements for safe generator operation in an enclosed space. The attached garage, sealed against the winter cold, began filling with carbon monoxide as the generator ran continuously. The colorless, odorless gas accumulated steadily as Steve worked frantically to maintain his animals' life support systems, unaware that he was slowly poisoning himself with each breath. Carbon monoxide is particularly insidious because it binds to hemoglobin more readily than oxygen, gradually reducing the body's ability to carry oxygen to vital organs. As CO2 levels rose throughout the evening, Steve became increasingly disoriented and failed to notice that vibrations from the generator had loosened a cage latch, allowing a 4-foot timber rattlesnake to escape onto the garage floor. The constant vibration from the running generator had gradually worked the latch mechanism loose, a failure that Steve would have immediately noticed under normal circumstances. The escaped timber rattlesnake represented one of the most dangerous species in Steve's collection. Also known as the canebrake rattlesnake in some regions, timber rattlesnakes are among the most formidable venomous snakes in North America. These heavy-bodied pit vipers can grow up to 6 feet in length and possess potent venom that combines both hemotoxic and neurotoxic properties, causing tissue destruction, blood clotting disorders, and nervous system damage that can be fatal if left untreated. Timber rattlesnakes are known for their generally docile nature compared to other rattlesnake species, often remaining motionless and relying on their excellent camouflage when threatened. Their coloration provides perfect camouflage among fallen leaves and forest debris. However, timber rattlesnakes will strike defensively when stepped on, cornered, or directly contacted. Their venom yield is substantial. A single bite can inject 100 to 150 milligrams of venom, with as little as 100 milligrams potentially fatal to an adult human. These snakes are ambush predators that can remain motionless for hours or even days while waiting for prey to come within striking range. Their heat-sensing pit organs allow them to detect warm-blooded animals with remarkable precision, even in complete darkness. When they do strike, their speed is explosive. They can extend their bodies nearly their full length in a fraction of a second. In his severely impaired state from carbon monoxide poisoning, Steve didn't see the snake coiled on the floor near his workbench and stepped directly onto it while checking equipment connections. The timber rattlesnake's response was purely defensive, a quick strike to the perceived threat followed by an immediate retreat to a defensive coil. The bite delivered a substantial dose of venom into Steve's ankle, penetrating deep into the tissue and immediately beginning the process of tissue destruction and systemic toxicity. Under normal circumstances, Steve would have immediately recognized the severity of the situation and implemented his well-rehearsed emergency protocols. However, the carbon monoxide poisoning had severely impaired his cognitive function, preventing him from thinking clearly about the protocols he had followed successfully over 2 decades. Steve became confused about the bite's significance and delayed calling for help. The combination of carbon monoxide poisoning and timber rattlesnake envenomation created a deadly synergy that attacked multiple organ systems simultaneously. The CO2 prevented his blood from carrying oxygen effectively, while the snake's venom caused additional respiratory depression and cardiac complications. Steve lost consciousness sometime after midnight, never realizing that his emergency solution had become his death trap. Emergency responders found him the next morning after neighbors reported concerns about generator exhaust visible from his property. The timber rattlesnake was discovered coiled peacefully in a corner of the garage, having returned to its preferred hiding behavior after the defensive strike. The incident led to mandatory carbon monoxide detector requirements for backup power systems in reptile facilities, and served as a sobering reminder that even emergency situations can create cascading failures that turn life-saving equipment into deadly hazards. Steve's death demonstrated how emergency situations can impair judgment and create dangerous conditions that experienced professionals might not anticipate. It was July 14th, 2016 in Dayton, Ohio. The summer heat lingered into the evening, pressing against the quiet neighborhood as porch lights flickered on. In one of the modest 2-story homes, the basement had been converted into a reptile room. That night, what was supposed to be routine maintenance of an enclosure ended in violence that could not be undone. Kelly Hammond was 38, a retail worker who had developed a reputation in her community for her fascination with snakes. Friends described her as steady and methodical, someone who spent most of her spare time caring for her collection. Over the years, she had accumulated more than a dozen pythons, Burmese and reticulated among them. It wasn't a casual hobby. Her basement contained heating systems, stacked glass enclosures, and feeding logs written in careful handwriting. Though she lacked formal training, she had immersed herself in books, online forums, and reptile shows. Neighbors sometimes saw her outside, a massive snake draped around her shoulders while she adjusted it with practiced movements. To her, the animals were not dangerous pets, but a challenge to manage responsibly. That night, her goal was simple: clean the enclosure of her largest reticulated python, a 16-foot specimen weighing over 120 pounds. She had handled it dozens of times before, confident that her familiarity and grip were enough. She invited a close friend to assist, partly to capture the routine on camera for her collection. It was a decision made casually, one that felt safe because it had always gone without incident. Reticulated pythons are the longest snakes in the world, with adults often exceeding 15 feet in captivity. Though non-venomous, they kill by constriction, tightening each coil every time their prey exhales. Their bodies are pure muscle, able to exert crushing pressure strong enough to crack ribs or stop circulation within minutes. Captive specimens retain the same hunting instincts as their wild counterparts, responding quickly to movement and body heat. Warnings existed. Local animal control had reminded reptile owners of the risks after prior incidents in Ohio, including fatal constrictions in private homes. Herpetologists caution against handling large pythons alone or without proper safety tools like hooks or barriers. Hammond had read these advisories but often felt they overstated the danger. She trusted her experience, having draped the snake around her shoulders countless times. That evening, her friend asked if it was safe to stand close with the camera. Hammond reassured her, saying the animal was used to handling. At first, the snake slid from her arms with slow, heavy movements. Hammond shifted its bolt carefully, trying to guide it into a temporary container while she cleaned. Then, in a sudden shift, the animal coiled upward, looping around Hammond's torso. Her arms were pinned against her sides, her balance tipping backward. At first, her friend thought it was part of the demonstration. Hammond had often shown how strong the python was, letting it cling to her before gently unwinding it. But this time, the coils tightened sharply, each contraction pushing deeper into her chest. She managed to say she couldn't breathe, her voice broken and strained. The python's head angled upward, pressing against her neck. Hammond staggered and fell hard onto the floor, the weight of the snake driving into her ribs. Her friend dropped the camera and tried to pry at the coils, but they didn't move. The snake's body tightened rhythmically, each exhale met with a squeeze. The sound of ribs cracking broke through the struggle, described later as a sharp snap like dry wood splitting. Hammond screamed once, then the air left her body in a shudder. Her face flushed red, then purple, as the python's body worked higher, circling her shoulders and jaw. The bulk of the animal covered her chest and head, muffling any further sound. Her friend pulled and shouted for help, but the weight and strength of the snake were impossible to overcome. A neighbor who heard the cries went in and saw the situation. He immediately called animal control. Minutes stretched as she went still, her body pinned under the shifting coils. By the time animal control arrived, Hammond was unresponsive. The python had loosened slightly, its body resting heavy across her torso. Removing it required multiple officers, each pulling to unwind the coils one by one. And by the time she was free, she was pronounced dead at the scene. Her body showed deep bruises along the chest and back, broken ribs, and severe compression injuries. Her funeral in Dayton was small, attended by family and a handful of fellow reptile enthusiasts. The service was quiet, reflecting her life more than her death. Local authorities seized her remaining snakes, relocating them to licensed facilities under tighter supervision. Ohio's Department of Agriculture reviewed private ownership laws for large constrictors, citing the case as evidence that stricter enforcement was necessary. Yet, even as Kelly Hammond's ribs cracked audibly under the crushing coils, just a year earlier in Florida, a teenager would wrap a massive anaconda around his shoulders to impress his classmates, never realizing that it was his final pose. It was March 19, 2015 in Tampa, Florida. The air was heavy with humidity, the kind that clung to garages and dim backyards as dusk set in. Inside one suburban home, the sounds of teenagers talking and laughing filled the cluttered space. A reptile cage dominated one corner, and what began as a show of confidence would end in silence that no one present could forget. Marcus Rivera was 17, a high school junior with a restless energy and a fascination with reptiles. Known among friends for showing off unusual pets, he had gradually collected lizards, pythons, and finally a green anaconda he had purchased from a private breeder despite local restrictions. He nurtured a reputation as the one willing to handle what others would not, priding himself on strength and control. His parents had warned him repeatedly, but he brushed it off, convinced he had the knowledge to manage the animals. For Marcus, the anaconda was not just a pet, but proof of his daring. He wasn't careless, he fed and cleaned its enclosure regularly, but he also enjoyed the thrill of draping the heavy body over his shoulders, posing for photos and videos. That evening, he invited 3 classmates over, promising to show them how he could handle the 12-foot snake. They came expecting a spectacle. His decision to stage the display in the garage, away from parental oversight, was typical of the way he balanced discipline with recklessness. The garage was dim, a single overhead bulb casting shadows across boxes and tools. A faint, musky odor came from the enclosure where the snake shifted restlessly. The humid Florida air pressed into the closed space, making every movement feel heavier. The teenagers gathered close, their attention fixed on Marcus as he prepared. Green anacondas are the heaviest snakes in the world, reaching lengths over 20 feet in the wild. Though smaller in captivity, even a 12-foot individual is a muscular predator capable of exerting immense pressure. Their instinct is not aggression but constriction, responding quickly to movement and heat, tightening coils each time their prey exhales. Unlike pythons, anacondas rely on sheer mass, wrapping and holding until circulation and breathing cease. In confined spaces, the risk increases as there is no distance for a handler to maneuver. Previously, Marcus's parents had told him repeatedly to leave the snake in its enclosure when friends visited. Even online forums he frequented were filled with cautionary stories of constrictors turning deadly. Even his classmates hesitated, one asking quietly if it was safe. Marcus dismissed the concerns, pointing out that he had handled the snake many times before. For him, the demonstration was routine, another opportunity to show his control. He opened the enclosure and drew the snake out slowly, its patterned body sliding across the floor with a weight that took effort to manage. At first, the movement was playful. Marcus smiled as he hefted the bulk over his shoulders, the snake draping around his neck and chest. The others filmed from close range, capturing his steady stance and the snake's slow, deliberate movements. Then the animal shifted, coiling tighter across his torso. At first, he laughed, adjusting his grip as though it were part of the show. But the coils kept sliding upward, circling his chest and throat. His expression changed, laughter giving way to a sharp intake of breath. His arms couldn't find leverage. He staggered backward, knees buckling under the weight. The muffled thud of his fall against the garage floor echoed as his friends shouted in confusion. He gasped, clawing at the muscular body pressed against his throat. Each exhale was met with another tightening. His face turned red, then darkened as the pressure built. The others tried to intervene, pulling at the coils, but the snake's body was immovable, its strength far beyond theirs. The sounds in the garage became a mix of his choking gasps and their frantic yelling. One friend pulled the pocket knife from his jeans and began jabbing at the snake's thick body, leaving only shadow cuts that oozed but did not deter it. Instead of loosening, the snake shifted again, circling tighter, driving its bulk across Marcus's ribs. One of his friends dialed 911. A loud crack rang out, the sound of bone giving way under pressure. His body convulsed briefly, heels scraping against the concrete before the motion slowed. The friends screamed his name, pulling, cutting, and shouting, but the snake did not release. By the time paramedics arrived, Marcus was motionless, his skin marked with deep bruises and abrasions where scales had torn into flesh. It took multiple responders to force the coils apart, prying and unwinding inch by inch until his body was freed. The snake lay subdued, and Marcus showed no pulse. Florida authorities seized the anaconda and emphasized the ongoing difficulties in enforcing exotic pet regulations. Local media reported briefly, focusing on the dangers of large constrictors in private homes, but coverage faded quickly. The funeral took place within the week, drawing classmates, teachers, and extended family. School counselors offered sessions for those who had witnessed the event, recognizing the trauma it left behind. While Marcus Rivera's body convulsed under the anaconda's crushing embrace, just 2 years later in Yorkshire, an experienced snakekeeper would lift his protective visor to wipe away sweat, giving a lightning-fast cobra the split second it needed to deliver its lethal bite. It was October 6, 2017 in rural Yorkshire, England. The air was damp and cool, mist drifting over quiet fields as evening settled in. In one outbuilding at the edge of a modest property, fluorescent light flickered across glass tanks and metal racks. What had begun as a routine cleaning task would soon turn into a fatal encounter. Alan Brooke was 44 years old, a part-time zoo volunteer and longtime reptile enthusiast. By profession, he worked irregular jobs in construction, but his reputation among reptile keepers was built on his private collection of snakes. He had started with pythons in his 20s, gradually shifting toward venomous species as his confidence grew. Friends in reptile circles regarded him as disciplined, though not without a degree of pride in handling animals others avoided. His property housed several cobras, vipers, and rattlesnakes in carefully secured enclosures. For Brooke, the animals represented both fascination and mastery. He'd read extensively about their behavior, practiced with handling tools, and visited other collections to compare methods. His habits were meticulous: gloves, hooks, tongs, and a visor when working directly with the snakes. Yet familiarity had dulled his sense of risk. He invited fellow hobbyists over to observe, often to demonstrate technique. That Friday evening, he had asked a friend to watch as he cleaned the enclosure of a monocled cobra, an adult specimen nearly 5 feet long. The plan was simple: remove the animal temporarily, clean the tank, and return it. The monocled cobra is native to South and Southeast Asia. Recognizable by the circular marking on the back of its hood, it can reach lengths of 7 feet. Its venom is primarily neurotoxic, disrupting nerve signals and leading to paralysis, symptoms can appear rapidly: drooping eyelids, slurred speech, difficulty breathing. Without specific antivenom, death may occur within hours, sometimes minutes depending on the dose. The species is considered unpredictable, prone to sudden defensive strikes if threatened or startled. Before the incident, warnings have been given many times. Colleagues at the zoo where Brooke volunteered had cautioned him against maintaining such species at home. Licensing rules were strict, requiring secure housing and protocols, but enforcement was light. His wife had asked him repeatedly to keep his collection smaller, pointing to the risks of a bite when no hospital nearby stocked the necessary antivenom. Even his visiting friend reminded them as they prepared that evening to keep the visor secured and never break concentration. Brooke acknowledged the risks, but believed his tools and experience were enough. He slid open the enclosure carefully, guiding the cobra out with a hook. The animal lifted its hood slightly, tongue flicking, but allowed itself to be placed into a holding tub. Brooke began cleaning, scraping away waste and replacing substrate while speaking casually about technique. Sweat gathered on his forehead under the visor. At one point he paused, raising the visor briefly to wipe his face with the back of his hand. His friend noted the lapse but said nothing, expecting the visor to drop back down. The strike was sudden. As Brooke leaned close to adjust the water dish, the cobra reared, head flattening into a hood, and struck forward. Its fangs punctured his left cheek just below the eye. He recoiled instantly, knocking the hook against the glass, and staggered back, clutching his face. Thin trails of blood mixed with saliva dripped onto the floor. His friend froze, then shouted for him to sit down. Within minutes, the symptoms began. Brooke's eyelids drooped, and his speech slurred as he tried to reassure himself aloud. His breathing grew shallow, each attempt more labored than the last. He dropped the visor and gloves, collapsing onto a chair as his muscles weakened. His friend dialed emergency services, his voice panicked, reporting the bite and naming the species. Operators instructed him to keep Brooke still and apply pressure immobilization, but there was little he could do. Brooke's hands trembled violently before his muscles began twitching, stiffening in uneven spasms as paralysis spread. By the time paramedics arrived, his skin was pale and clammy, his eyes unfocused. They began CPR after he lost consciousness, but no facility nearby carried the precise antivenom required for monocle cobra envenomation. He was rushed toward the nearest hospital. An oxygen mask pressed over his face, but the paralysis spread, shutting down his ability to breathe independently. Despite all measures, he was pronounced dead less than 2 hours after the bite. The aftermath was quiet. His body was released to his family within days. At his funeral, a small group gathered: relatives, a few colleagues from the zoo, and reptile enthusiasts who had known him through forums and meetings. Local authorities reviewed his permits and seized the venomous animals from the property. In Yorkshire, officials tightened monitoring of exotic animal licensing, though no new laws were passed. However, even as Alan Brooks staggered with cobra venom dripping from his cheek, 4 years earlier in Texas, a retiree would discover that 20 years of raising his prized Burmese python meant nothing when 20 feet of crushing muscle was unleashed upon his aging body. It was May 24th, 2013, outside San Antonio, Texas. The spring evening was still and heavy with heat, the kind that lingered after the sun had dropped. In a weathered shed at the back of a rural property, a retired man struggled with an animal he had raised for years. The situation would escalate slowly, then violently, until it left him lifeless on the ground. Harold Duncan was 61 years old, a retired machinist who had spent much of his later life in seclusion. Widowed and with few close friends, he poured his energy into an unusual pursuit, keeping large snakes. He had built a series of makeshift enclosures in his shed, reinforced with plywood, wire, and chains. Neighbors knew him only in passing, remarking on the occasional smell of rodents or the faint hiss that carried on quiet nights. Among reptile enthusiasts, he was less known, but those who had visited described him as dedicated, methodical, and proud of his collection. The centerpiece of his animals was a Burmese python he had acquired as a juvenile nearly 2 decades earlier. By 2013, the snake measured over 20 feet and weighed more than 200 pounds. Duncan often boasted privately to relatives that the python was calm and accustomed to his presence. Burmese pythons are among the largest snakes in the world, capable of growing over 20 feet and exerting immense constriction pressure. Their bodies are built for ambush predation, wrapping prey and tightening with every exhalation until circulation and breathing cease. Though not venomous, their power alone makes them capable of killing a human in minutes. In captivity, they may appear tame, but their instincts remain unchanged. Even long-term owners face sudden shifts in behavior, especially during feeding or when the animal feels confined. He rarely asked for help handling it, insisting he could manage the animal on his own. His habits were consistent: feeding frozen rabbits, cleaning the enclosure monthly, and repairing the aging structure when needed. That spring, one of the cage latches had broken. Rather than leave the snake contained and call for assistance, Duncan decided to move it himself to another holding area. Relatives had urged Duncan not to handle the python alone, pointing out his age and declining strength. Local authorities, responding to previous calls about the snakes, had noted the inadequate housing but stopped short of seizing the animal. A neighbor recalled hearing odd thuds and muffled calls from the shed earlier that evening, but assumed it was routine. But when Duncan's niece stopped by to drop off groceries and found the shed door ajar, she discovered him inside, already entangled. The python had coiled around Duncan's lower body, pinning his legs together with bands of muscle. His face was dark red, his breath shallow and broken. He could only force out a few gasps before falling silent. Each attempt to push the animal away only caused it to cinch tighter. The shed echoed with the scrape of wood as Duncan stumbled back against the wall, dragging the massive reptile with him. The coils rose higher, locking around his abdomen and chest. He dropped to the floor under the weight, his arms pinned awkwardly against his side. His niece later told deputies she heard a faint groan and then nothing more as his chest compressed. The sound of ribs giving way was faint but distinct. She screamed for help, running to the road to flag passing drivers. The python shifted again, wrapping around his neck and head, leaving only muffled grunts beneath its tightening grip. Duncan's movement slowed, his body jerking weakly as his airway collapsed. When deputies and animal control arrived minutes later, the scene was grim. The snake held Duncan flat against the floor, its coil spread across his torso and face, eyes fixed forward. The officers attempted to pry it off, but the pressure was immovable. Finally, one officer raised a shotgun and fired into the snake's body. The coil slackened gradually, the massive animal thrashing weakly before falling still. Duncan lay beneath it, unresponsive. His chest collapsed inward from the crushing force. Paramedics confirmed he had suffered massive internal injuries and cardiac arrest, declaring him dead at the scene. In the days that followed, the property was cleared of the remaining snakes, most smaller but still exotic. Authorities cited the unsafe enclosures and lack of proper permits, though no charges were filed posthumously. His funeral was modest, attended by a handful of relatives and 2 former co-workers. There were no eulogies beyond a brief statement from a cousin about his quiet life. Among neighbors, the reaction was muted, with a few expressing relief that the snakes were gone. Harold Duncan's desperate gasps echoed through his Texas shed, while 5 years later in Jakarta, a breeder would lift a king cobra with his bare hands to impress potential buyers, dismissing the ancient predator's lightning-fast strike. It was December 1st, 2018 in Jakarta, Indonesia. The day had ended hot and thick with humidity, and inside a small residential neighborhood, a narrow house doubled as a reptile workshop. Within its concrete walls, glass tanks lined the room, their contents restless in the warm air. Among them was a snake unlike the others, larger, faster, and far more dangerous. By nightfall, its keeper would be dead. Rizky Hartono was 32 years old, known in Jakarta's small reptile trade circles as a determined breeder with a steady supply of both native and exotic species. He sold pythons, vipers, and other snakes to local collectors, making side income that supplemented his modest day job as a delivery driver. He had gained a reputation for being bold with his animals, often handling them bare-handed to prove he could. To his buyers, this gave him authority. To his family, it was reckless. Still, for Hartono, the snakes were his passion, and he believed they could bring him enough recognition to expand into a larger business. The centerpiece of his collection was a massive king cobra, nearly 12 feet long, purchased through informal channels. He saw it as proof he could handle the most respected and feared species in Southeast Asia. To him, demonstrating control of such a snake was both a selling point and a test of skill. The cobra lived in a reinforced glass enclosure in the corner of his breeding room. The king cobra, the longest venomous snake in the world, can reach over 18 feet in length and deliver enough neurotoxic venom in a single bite to kill an elephant. Its strike is sudden and precise, capable of hitting vital areas even when handled by experts. Unlike many snakes, cobras can deliver multiple strikes in rapid succession, and their venom attacks the nervous system, causing paralysis and respiratory failure. Handling one without protective gear is a direct confrontation with a lethal predator. The house stood in a dense neighborhood, concrete alleys crowded with parked scooters, laundry lines strung between windows, and the smell of cooking oil heavy in the air. Inside Hartono's reptile room, the overhead bulb cast sharp shadows against the tanks, highlighting the dull scales of coiled snakes. When two customers arrived that evening, Hartono saw an opportunity to make an impression, deciding to bring the animal out directly rather than relying on hooks or tongs. His motivation was not carelessness but conviction that showing confidence with the cobra would close the sale. However, warnings had surrounded Hartono for years. Other breeders had told him not to free-handle venomous snakes. His own uncle had cautioned him that anti-venom was not always available in local clinics. That evening, one of the customers hesitated as Hartono unlatched the cobra's tank, suggesting they observe from behind the glass. Hartono brushed it off, insisting he had experience. His choice was less about arrogance than about trust in a routine that had not yet failed him. He slid open the glass and reached inside, gripping the thick body just behind the head. At first, the cobra stiffened, its hood flaring, tongue flicking rapidly as it read the air. Hartono raised it chest high, turning toward the two men to demonstrate the size and control. For a moment, it appeared manageable. Then, the cobra coiled abruptly in his hands, twisting with startling speed. Before Hartono could adjust, it struck his forearm, once, then again, sinking its fangs deep. Witnesses later described him freezing, his eyes wide as if trying to process the suddenness of the bite. His grip slackened, and he set the snake back into its enclosure, locking it with trembling fingers. He tried to dismiss the incident, insisting it wasn't serious. But within 10 minutes, his condition began to change. First dizziness and nausea, then vomiting into a bucket by the wall. His skin grew pale as he staggered, clutching the bitten arm. As the next 20 minutes passed, neurotoxic symptoms advanced. His speech slurred, his eyelids drooped, and his jaw muscles weakened. He dropped heavily to the floor. The customers, panicked, tried to support him, one rushing outside to hail a motorcycle taxi. They carried him into the street, his legs dragging, his eyes half-lidded as his breath turned shallow and irregular. By the time they reached a nearby clinic, his pulse was erratic, his body seizing as the neurotoxin advanced. The staff could do little. They had no Cobra anti-venom in stock. An ambulance was called to transfer him to a larger hospital across the city. During the ride, his breathing ceased, his chest heaving once before going still. Paramedics performed compressions, but by the time they arrived at the hospital, his heart had already stopped. Efforts to restart it failed. Back at the house, police sealed off the reptile room, photographing the enclosure and securing the live cobra for transfer to a government facility. The customers provided statements, explaining how quickly the strike had unfolded. Hartono's phone, left on the table, still displayed the open gallery where he had shown them pictures of previous sales just minutes before the attack. His funeral, held 2 days later, was modest. Family members, shaken but subdued, stood alongside a handful of reptile enthusiasts who had known him casually. Indonesian authorities released a statement afterward, reminding the public that handling venomous snakes without protective tools is illegal, and that private ownership of species like king cobras poses risks beyond the individual. No charges were filed against the family, and the story ran only in local outlets. It was March 15, 2017, near Palu, central Sulawesi. The air was heavy with humidity, and the fading light gave the swampy lowlands a muted greenish haze. It was the kind of evening where the bush seemed still on the surface, yet alive with hidden movement. By nightfall, the shortcut Agus Hartono had taken hundreds of times would become the scene of an encounter few could survive. Agus, 49, had worked in palm oil plantations since his teens. He was known among his co-workers for moving quickly through tasks and avoiding unnecessary breaks. People said he disliked relying on others for rides, and often boasted that decades of outdoor work had made him unfazed by the wildlife. The shortcut home along a narrow drainage path saved him nearly 20 minutes, and he had walked it for years despite thick vegetation and poorly drained sections that could flood ankle deep in the rainy season. That day, he had stayed late to finish clearing a section of overgrowth. A co-worker offered him a lift back to the village, but Agus waved it off, saying the weather was clear. Villagers had spoken over the past week about a large snake sighted in the area. Some estimated it over 20 feet, but sightings were not unusual, and Agus dismissed them as exaggerated. His machete hung at his side, more a tool than a weapon in his mind. The drainage path was a narrow strip of firm ground bordered by stagnant water and stands of nipa palm. The air smelled of decaying vegetation, and the clouds of mosquitoes clung to the shade. On one side, brush leaned over the path in heavy clusters. On the other, the canal's surface was broken only by occasional ripples. Dusk blurred the edges of the water and ground, making it difficult to see where one ended and the other began. Reticulated pythons in this region can reach lengths of over 25 feet, weigh over 200 pounds, with girth as thick as a grown man's thigh. they ambush from cover, striking with surprising speed for their size. Once coiled, they tighten with each breath their prey exhales, collapsing the chest until air can no longer enter. Large individuals are capable of subduing animals heavier than the human, and in rare cases, they've been recorded attempting to consume people whole. Two men walking parallel along a dirt road on the opposite side of the canal later said they heard a sharp splash, followed by a muffled yell. Looking toward the sound, they saw Agus stumble backward, his machete swinging in jerks. The python had come from the brush beside the canal, striking high and wrapping its body around his torso. Its tail coiled low around his legs, pulling him off balance. Agus tried to hack at the snake's body, but each swing was short and awkward. The coils locked tighter with each movement, compressing his ribs until his shouts turned into short, ragged gasps. One of the men ran down the embankment and grabbed the python's tail, attempting to pull it free, but the force of the snake's movements threw him sideways into the mud. The struggle lasted several minutes. Witnesses described the sound of Agus's breathing stopping abruptly, his head dropping forward. The python held its grip even after he went still, adjusting the coil slightly to maintain pressure. When villagers arrived in response to the shouting, they brought more machetes and began hacking at the thick, patterned body. The snake did not release him until its head and several feet of its neck were severed. When the coils loosened, the python's intention became clear. It had already begun to position Agus's head toward its mouth. Villagers pulled his body free before the swallowing attempt advanced. His face was smeared with mud, and his machete was still in his right hand. One man ran to the village to call for medical help, while others attempted chest compressions on the spot. Paramedics from the nearest clinic arrived nearly 30 minutes later, confirming he had no pulse. A brief autopsy performed the next day at the local health center reported multiple rib fractures, deep contusions around the chest and abdomen consistent with constriction, and signs of asphyxiation as the cause of death. Agus's funeral was held that afternoon in accordance with local Muslim customs, with the body washed, shrouded, and buried before sunset. Dozens of villagers attended, some still shaken by the attack, and prayers were offered for his family's safety. Local authorities documented the scene, measured the snake, and took statements from witnesses for their incident report. Wildlife officers disposed of the carcass and issued renewed warnings to plantation workers about avoiding isolated drainage paths after dusk. Agus's mistake served as a brutal reminder that these predators strike without warning. Meanwhile, in Thailand, a snake breeder's overconfidence with his most prized specimen would end in tragedy. It was June 21, 2015, in Nakhon Si Thammarat Province, Thailand. The air was thick from a storm that had rolled through an hour earlier, leaving puddles in the dirt and a faint smell of wet earth. The overcast sky dimmed the daylight, and in the low light of the snake shed, movements inside the cages seemed sharper, more deliberate. Somchai Phan, who had made a career out of handling dangerous reptiles, was about to break one of the first rules he used to teach beginners: never clean a venomous snake's enclosure without removing the animal. Somchai was 36, the son of a rice farmer who had turned his fascination with snakes into a livelihood. Over the past 12 years, he had supplied local reptile parks with cobras, vipers, and pythons, earning a reputation for being both skilled and fearless. He lived with his wife and young daughter in a small house behind his breeding facility. Though careful with most of his animals, he believed his 13-foot king cobra, raised from a hatchling, recognized him. It was his most prized specimen, and he often showed it off to friends, demonstrating what he called its calm nature. On that afternoon, he had invited 2 locals to see the snake. His assistant, familiar with its moods, advised against working inside the enclosure while the cobra remained in it. Somchai dismissed the concern, saying the storm's cooler air would make the animal sluggish. The cobra lay stretched along the far wall of its pen, its head elevated slightly, tongue flicking. Somchai entered with a bucket and a rag, intending to replace the water bowl and wipe down the floor. The shed was built from corrugated metal, the walls lined with wooden enclosures. Rain dripped steadily from the roof edges outside, and the air carried the damp organic smell of reptile bedding. The cobra's pen was 6 feet deep with a clear acrylic front panel, giving the friends a direct view of the animal's movements. The dim light made its scales glint a muted olive, broken by pale bands on its hood. King cobras, the largest venomous snakes in the world, can reach over 18 feet and weigh up to 20 pounds. They can deliver enough neurotoxic venom in a single bite to kill an elephant. Unlike many snakes, they'll hold their ground and can rear up to a third of their body length, striking from a distance that surprises even experienced handlers. Cooler temperatures often make them more alert rather than sluggish, and storms can heighten their defensive responses. The first warning came when the snake's head lifted higher, hood widening as Somchai reached toward the water bowl. His friends saw the body shift, muscles tightening in subtle waves. Somchai tapped lightly at the hood with the back of his hand, a demonstration he had done before. The cobra's strike was almost silent, a blur covering the 3-foot gap. Its fangs sank deep into his left forearm. Somchai jerked back, clutching his arm but laughing in what appeared to be bravado. He told the onlookers he knew how to handle a bite, even as 2 puncture wounds welled blood down his wrist. His assistant grabbed a cloth, tying it tightly above the elbow while attempting mouth suction, a method widely known to be ineffective. Within 90 seconds, Somchai's voice thickened, and he swayed on his feet. His pupils narrowed, and his breathing grew shallow. The 2 friends helped lower him to the floor, his machete for cleaning still lying near the enclosure door. The cobra remained in the pen, hood still spread, watching the movement outside its glass front. Starting the 40-minute drive to the nearest hospital, 5 minutes into the trip, his limbs went limp and his breathing became faint, punctuated by brief gasps. The assistant attempted mouth-to-mouth resuscitation while the truck sped along the narrow road. By the time they reached the hospital gates, Somchai's chest had stopped moving. Medical staff attempted to ventilate him, but the neurotoxin had already paralyzed his respiratory muscles. He was pronounced dead within minutes of arrival. Back at the facility, authorities arrived to secure the cobra and other venomous snakes. The king cobra, still coiled in the same spot, was removed under strict containment protocols. The rest of the snakes were confiscated, citing improper safety measures and the risk to the surrounding community. Somchai's funeral was held the next day in the village temple, attended by family, friends, and several local park operators who had worked with him over the years. His assistant spoke briefly about the dangers of overconfidence, noting that Somchai had taught others to respect the unpredictability of snakes, but had forgotten that lesson himself in the moment. The incident prompted a short-lived discussion among local authorities about licensing and safety standards for private venomous snake keepers, though no formal changes were made. Yet, even as Somchai's fatal overconfidence became a proof that serpents remain unpredictable regardless of years of handling, just over a year later in the Amazon, a fisherman's simple dare would bring him face to face with a green anaconda. It was October 4th, 2016, near Barcelos in the Brazilian state of the Amazonas. The river was calm under a heavy, humid sky, the water reflecting a dull green from the dense forest canopy. For those who knew its currents and depths, it was an ordinary day. For Joe Silva, the river he had worked on since boyhood would become the place he would not leave alive. Joe was 28, a fisherman like his father and grandfather. He was known among locals for his strong swimming and habit of entering the water even when others stayed ashore. He lived in a small wooden house near the docks with his wife and 2 children, and most of his income came from selling tuna carre and piranha to the market in Barcelos. Joe prided himself on being capable in the river, often telling others that the dangers were overstated, that people were too quick to let fear guide them. His work demanded long hours and constant adaptation to shifting river conditions, and in his mind, swimming was simply another skill he had mastered. This trip upriver had been routine, a 3-day run with 2 close friends, catching and cleaning fish to bring home before the next weather shift. That morning, they had filled the large cooler with their catch. While cleaning the fish at the muddy bank of a narrow channel, Joe had been teased for his reluctance to accept a dare from one of his friends: swim across the water and back. The channel wasn't wide, barely 30 yards. The channel itself was part of a floodplain network where large predators hunted. Green anacondas, the largest snakes in the Americas, can reach over 20 feet in length and weigh more than 200 pounds. They're ambush hunters, often lying motionless in shallow water, relying on camouflage to get close before striking. Their bite is used to secure prey before their coils constrict it. Attacks on humans are rare, but not unheard of in more remote stretches, especially during the dry season when prey grows scarce and water levels drop, forcing both fish and predators into tighter spaces. There had been warnings that week. Other fishermen mentioned seeing large ripples and brief flashes of dark scales in that channel. One man claimed a cow had gone missing near its banks just 2 weeks earlier. Joe had heard the talk but laughed it off, telling his friends he had swum there before without trouble. The dares at the cleaning site felt more like routine banter than a serious challenge. Without hesitation, he waded in, pushing through the surface vegetation until the muddy slope dropped away beneath his feet. The water was opaque, warm against his skin. He struck out with a strong breaststroke, keeping his head above the patches of floating grass. About halfway across, his right leg brushed something thick and unyielding. He kicked harder, assuming it was a submerged branch. The branch moved. In the next instant, something seized his upper arm with crushing force. His body jolted sideways, and he let out a sharp cry. From the bank, his friend saw a thick, dark body surge upward just enough for them to make out its size, thicker than a man's thigh. The snake's head broke the surface, its jaws locked onto Joe's bicep. In the same motion, it wrapped its body around his torso, the coil sliding with a slow, purposeful grip. Joe's arms flailed above the water, then pressed desperately against the tightening loops. One of his friends grabbed a machete and ran into the water, shouting as he slashed toward the snake. But the anaconda began a slow roll, pulling Joe under. The rescuer got within a few feet, but couldn't see where to strike without risking hitting Joe. The water churned with bubbles and silt. Then, in a sudden lurch, both man and snake vanished beneath the surface. The rescuer surfaced seconds later, coughing and gasping, his hands empty. He waded back to the bank, scanning for movement. But the channel was calm again, only the floating vegetation shifting slightly as if settling back into place. They shouted for help from passing boats and used the radio to alert local authorities. It took 15 minutes of searching before Joe's body was found, floating near the opposite bank. His skin was mottled with deep bruises across his chest and abdomen where the coils had constricted. The upper arm bore 2 deep arcs of puncture wounds, matching the placement of the snake's fangs. His face was pale, his eyes half closed, his limbs limp in the current. They pulled him ashore in silence, laying him out on the muddy grass. The cooler of fish was left behind as the men wrapped Joe in the tarp and brought him back downriver. His funeral took place the next morning in a small riverside chapel, attended by family, neighbors, and fellow fishermen. His wife sat beside the casket, silent except when speaking to their children. Local authorities issued a reminder to avoid secluded channels during the low water months, citing reduced prey availability and increased predator activity. The advice echoed through the fishing community for a short time before fading back into the background of the many other risks the river always carried. Even though Joe's recklessness ended in the mercy of an anaconda thousands of miles away in Florida, a retiree's stubbornness would bring him within striking distance of a venomous rattlesnake. It was July 29, 2018, near Ocala, Florida. The late summer heat sat heavy over the neighborhood, the air thick with humidity and the constant buzz of cicadas. In the quiet stretch of the afternoon, the stillness of a backyard chicken coop would be broken by a decision that, once made, could not be undone. Robert Miller was 61, a retired auto mechanic who had spent most of his life working in repair shops around Marion County. He was known among friends and neighbors for his stubborn self-reliance and habit of dealing with wildlife on his own terms. For years, he had caught non-venomous snakes barehanded, often showing them off to his grandchildren before letting them go. It was a mix of bravado and habit, something he had done since he was young, and something he believed showed his control over the hazards of rural life. That day, Robert had been tending his small backyard coop, a dozen chickens scratching through the dirt for feed. He took pride in the coop, repairing it himself after storms and keeping it free from predators when he could. Snakes were not unusual visitors, drawn by eggs and small chicks. He rarely saw them as a threat to himself, only to the birds. The idea of calling animal control for a snake in his own yard felt unnecessary to him, something a capable man shouldn't need. The yard was lined with wire fencing and shaded by a few drooping oaks. The air smelled faintly of feed and damp soil. Beyond the coop, the grass grew patchy and uneven, the ground dotted with tire ruts from an old riding mower. A porch ran along the side of Robert's house, where his neighbor, Mark, sat in a weathered chair 40 feet away. In the bright Florida sun, a movement near the coop's nesting box caught Robert's attention. Eastern diamondback rattlesnakes are the largest rattlesnake species in North America, often exceeding 6 feet in length and weighing over 10 pounds. They carry potent hemotoxic venom capable of causing rapid tissue destruction, internal bleeding, and severe cardiovascular collapse. Though they typically avoid humans, they will stand their ground if threatened, relying on camouflage until cornered, then using their rattle as a final warning before striking. Mark saw the snake first and called out to Robert, telling him to use a stick or call for help. The diamond-shaped head and thick patterned body were unmistakable even from a distance. Robert brushed off the advice, stepping into the coop and positioning himself behind the reptile. The snake held still at first, relying on its coloration to blend against the dry grass and shadowed boards. Then, as Robert reached down, the rattle sounded, short, sharp bursts cutting through the humid air. Robert moved quickly, grabbing the snake just behind the head, his fingers clamping the thick neck. He lifted it up, turning toward the porch with a grin. The snake's body writhed violently, its coils twisting in the air, the heavy tail shaking. Mark shouted again for him to drop it, but Robert only adjusted his grip, shifting his weight slightly to keep balance on the uneven ground. The movement was small, almost invisible from the porch, but his grip slipped. The snake's neck flexed just long enough for its head to swing sideways. In one fast motion, the fang sank deep into Robert's left wrist, just above the joint. His hand jerked open and the snake fell, landing in the dust before sliding quickly toward the fence line. Robert stepped back but didn't retreat entirely, muttering that it wasn't serious. Mark saw the swelling begin within minutes. Robert's wrist reddened and puffed up, the skin stretched tight. He sat down heavily on the edge of the coop, breathing harder, his face damp with sweat. Mark called 911, keeping his eyes on Robert, who leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, his shoulders rising and falling faster. By the time the paramedics arrived, 12 minutes later, Robert's skin had taken on a pale, clammy hue, and he was struggling to keep his head up. The paramedics worked quickly, loading him onto a stretcher and securing an oxygen mask. His blood pressure was already dangerously low, and his pulse was erratic. They began fluids and tried to keep him responsive, but his breathing slowed further on the short drive toward Ocala Regional Medical Center. Additionally, the bite struck a vein, accelerating the venom spread. He went into cardiac arrest before arrival and was pronounced dead minutes later. The county medical examiner noted 2 deep puncture wounds with surrounding tissue damage consistent with an eastern diamondback bite. The venom had caused rapid cardiovascular collapse, a severe reaction made worse by the location of the bite and the time to treatment. Robert's family was notified that evening, his wife and 2 daughters gathering quietly at the house. The funeral took place 3 days later, a small gathering under a canvas tent at the local cemetery. Only close relatives attended, along with a handful of neighbors. There were no speeches beyond a short prayer. County wildlife officers later issued a statement urging residents to avoid handling venomous snakes without proper equipment or training. Robert's overconfidence with a backyard rattlesnake proved fatal in Florida. Meanwhile, miles away in South Africa, a young field assistant would discover that professional training meant nothing when facing the lightning-fast strike of Africa's most feared serpent. It was September 18, 2014, in the rural farmlands of KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. The morning air was warm but not yet oppressive, and the sugarcane field stood tall and still under a pale sky. It was the kind of day where work moved steadily and without incident, until a moment of misjudgment changed its course. Thabu Ntembu was 34, a field assistant working for a regional herpetology research project that specialized in venomous snakes. He had been with the program for 4 years, valued for his knowledge of the land and his ability to navigate both farmland and the wild scrub beyond it. Thabo was not formally trained in science, but he was quick to learn, often trusted to assist with field measurements, GPS logging, and photographic records. He took pride in the role, seeing it as a bridge between his rural upbringing and formal research work. This trip had taken him and a senior researcher to a series of smallholder farms where sugarcane bordered patches of native grassland. They were documenting snake activity during the warmer months when sightings increased. Thabo's personal goal was to add to the project's growing library of photographs, images that help with identification and educational outreach. Though aware of the dangers, he believed that proximity and quick reflexes could make for better, clearer images, a mindset shaped by years of working close to animals. The dirt paths between the cane fields were narrow, hemmed in by walls of green stalks that rose over 8 feet high. Dry leaves littered the ground, rustling faintly in the light wind. Beyond the fields lay patches of bush where thorn trees cast narrow shadows. The stillness of the morning was broken only by the hum of insects and the occasional call of birds overhead. Visibility was limited. Anything moving at ground level could vanish into cover within seconds. Black mambas are among the quickest and most dangerous snakes in the world, capable of reaching speeds over 12 miles per hour in short bursts. They can grow longer than 14 feet and are known for their potent neurotoxic venom, which can cause respiratory failure within hours if untreated. While generally avoiding human contact, they can become highly defensive when threatened, raising the front third of their bodies and delivering multiple rapid strikes. Their warning, an open black mouth, is as distinctive as it is brief. Earlier that week, local farmers had mentioned mamba sightings near the outer cane rows, warning the researchers to keep to the central paths and avoid dense grass. That morning, the senior researcher reminded Thabo to maintain distance and not to block a snake's path, as most would retreat if given space. These words came back only minutes before the encounter. While crossing a narrow track, the two men saw movement ahead, a large dark shape gliding from one side of the path to the other. Thabo was holding the camera. The mamba's size and visibility against the pale dirt was exactly the sort of image he wanted. Ignoring the instruction to hold back, he stepped forward, angling himself so the snake would have to pause before entering the far grass. The senior researcher called for him to stop, but Thabo was already crouching slightly, lifting the camera to his eye. The mamba reacted instantly. It turned toward him, the front third of its body rising until its head was level with its waist. The mouth opened wide, showing the black interior. Then it struck, 2 rapid bites to his lower torso, followed by a third to the upper thigh. The entire attack lasted less than 2 seconds. The snake then dropped back to the ground and slid into the grass, disappearing almost as quickly as it had appeared. Thabo stepped backward, dropping the camera to hang from its strap. His left hand went to his side, where the fabric of his shirt was already marked by 2 small punctures. The senior researcher reached him in seconds, guiding him down to sit and pulling out the bandage for pressure immobilization. He radioed for their driver, who was stationed a quarter-mile away, and began wrapping Thabo's leg as well. Within minutes, Thabo's speech slurred, and his eyelids grew heavy. His breathing became shallow, and he struggled to keep his head upright. They carried him to the vehicle and laid him in the back seat. On the dirt road toward the highway, the senior researcher monitored his pulse, which was rapid but weakening. By the time they reached the main road, Thabo had lost consciousness. The clinic in the nearest town was 12 miles away, but the vehicle was still 3 miles short when his breathing stopped. CPR was attempted while continuing the drive, but there was no response. At the clinic, he was pronounced dead on arrival. The estimated time from bite to death was under 40 minutes. His funeral was held in his home village 3 days later. Fellow researchers attended, standing alongside family and friends in a small outdoor service. The coffin was simple, carried by relatives from the church to the burial site. The project director later spoke privately with the family, expressing that Thabo's contributions to the research were valued and that his death underscored the risks inherent in the work. Within a week, local environmental authorities installed signs at key points along the sugarcane fields warning of mamba crossings. Farmers adjusted their harvest schedules to avoid certain times of day when snake activity was highest. It was April 18, 2016, and the humid Florida evening air hung heavy around the small strip mall in Jacksonville where Tommy Valdez ran his exotic pet store. The shop, squeezed between a laundromat and a check-cashing business, had been his dream for nearly a decade, but lately it felt more like a nightmare. Inside, the familiar sounds of bubbling aquariums and rustling reptiles filled the cramped space, while fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across rows of terrariums and snake enclosures. At 33, Tommy had been working with exotic reptiles for 9 years, building his reputation among collectors and enthusiasts throughout North Florida. His store specialized in rare snakes and lizards, catering to customers willing to pay premium prices for unusual specimens. But the exotic pet market had grown increasingly competitive, and recent months have been brutal for his small business. Online retailers were undercutting his prices, local regulations were tightening, and expensive veterinary bills had drained his savings account. The centerpiece of Tommy's collection was Titan, a massive female reticulated python he had acquired 3 years earlier as a juvenile. She had grown into a magnificent specimen, 22 feet of pure muscle and predatory instinct, weighing nearly 250 pounds. Tommy had turned down multiple offers from private collectors, but now, facing bankruptcy and mounting debts, he had finally agreed to sell her to a wealthy collector in Miami. Reticulated pythons are among the world's longest snakes, capable of reaching lengths over 30 feet and weights exceeding 300 pounds. Native to Southeast Asia, they're powerful constrictors known for their aggressive temperament and opportunistic feeding behavior. While not native to Florida, reticulated pythons were legal to keep in captivity with proper permits, making them popular among exotic pet owners and reptile dealers before Florida's reptile of concern laws were tightened in 2010. Unlike their more docile cousins, reticulated pythons retain their wild instincts even in captivity, viewing anything that moves as potential prey. Their strike speed is exceptional, and their constricting power can generate over 90 pounds of pressure per square inch, enough to crush bones and stop a human heart within minutes. That evening, Tommy had stayed late to prepare Titan for transport to her new owner, who was scheduled to pick her up the following morning. The massive python hadn't been fed in over 2 weeks, partly due to Tommy's financial constraints, and partly because he wanted her to be more manageable during the transfer. But hungry reticulated pythons are notoriously unpredictable, and Tommy's cost-cutting measures had eliminated the assistant who usually helped him handle the larger snakes. Tommy entered Titan's enclosure carrying a large shipping container, planning to coax the massive snake inside for transport. The python was coiled in the far corner of her custom-built habitat, her distinctive diamond-patterned scales catching the overhead lights. Her head was raised and alert, tongue flicking rapidly as she sensed Tommy's approach. The attack came with devastating swiftness. Titan struck like a coiled spring releasing, her massive head covering the distance between them faster than Tommy could react. Her powerful jaws clamped around his torso as her body began wrapping around him with terrifying efficiency. Tommy's startled cry was cut short as 250 pounds of muscle coiled around his chest and arms, the python's grip tightening with each breath he tried to take. The constriction was methodical and relentless. Titan's coils worked in waves, each loop of her body finding purchase around Tommy's ribcage, waist, and neck. The pressure was immense, far beyond what the human body could withstand. Tommy's ribs began cracking under the strain as the python's muscles contracted in powerful pulses, each squeeze tighter than the last. His struggles only triggered the snake's instincts to constrict harder. her grip becoming a deadly vice that compressed his chest cavity and cut off his air supply. Within minutes, Tommy's movement ceased as the python's crushing embrace stopped his heart and collapsed his lungs. But Titan wasn't finished. Over the next several hours, the massive snake began the slow, methodical process of consumption. Her jaws unhinged with mechanical precision, stretching impossibly wide as she worked Tommy's body head first into her throat. Tommy's body wasn't discovered until 3 days later, when regular customers found the store closed during normal business hours and called police for a welfare check. Officers discovered the gruesome scene in the back room. Titan coiled contently in her enclosure, her body grotesquely swollen from her massive meal, with only Tommy's legs still visible protruding from her jaws. The Jacksonville Police Department's investigation ruled the death accidental, citing improper handling procedures and the victim's decision to work alone with an extremely dangerous animal. Animal control officers removed all the reptiles from the store, with Titan being relocated to a licensed facility after veterinarians safely extracted Tommy's remains. Tommy's death sent shockwaves through Florida's exotic pet community, where he had been well known and respected despite his recent financial troubles. His funeral was attended by dozens of fellow dealers and collectors who remembered him as passionate but increasingly desperate in his final months. But Tommy wasn't the only expert who underestimated the deadly power of a massive python. Deep in the rainforest of Borneo, experienced jungle guide Ahmad Hassan was about to discover that even decades of experience meant nothing when facing a hungry, reticulated python. It was August 7, 2015, and the Borneo rainforest pulsed with life in the sweltering afternoon heat. Deep in the remote interior of Sarawak, Malaysia, where the jungle canopy blocked most sunlight and the air hung thick with moisture and the calls of exotic birds, experienced guide Ahmad Hassan moved carefully along an animal trail he had never explored before. The sounds of the rainforest surrounded him. The distant whoops of orangutans, the rustle of small mammals in the undergrowth, and the constant buzz of insects. This was exactly the kind of pristine wilderness that drew adventure tourists from around the world, and Ahmad was always searching for new routes to offer his clients. At 41, Ahmad had been leading tourists through Borneo's rainforest for 15 years, building a reputation as one of the most knowledgeable and fearless guides in the region. He had survived encounters with king cobras, saltwater crocodiles, and aggressive orangutans, earning the respect of both clients and fellow guides. His intimate knowledge of jungle survival and animal behavior had saved lives on multiple occasions, and he took pride in his ability to handle any dangerous situation the rainforest could present. This solo scouting expedition was part of Ahmad's preparation for a new ecotourism route that would take adventurous clients deeper into the jungle than most tour operators dared to venture. He had been hiking for 3 hours, mapping GPS coordinates and noting potential campsites, when he encountered an obstacle that would test his jungle expertise in the most deadly way possible. Reticulated pythons are the apex predators of Southeast Asian rainforests, capable of growing to enormous sizes in the prey-rich environment of Borneo. These massive constrictors are ambush hunters that can remain motionless for hours before striking with explosive speed. They're excellent swimmers and climbers, equally at home in trees or water, and their hunting territory can span several square miles. When hungry or threatened, they become extremely aggressive, viewing any large, warm-blooded animal as potential prey. Blocking the narrow trail ahead was a massive male reticulated python, easily 19 feet long and as thick as a telephone pole. The snake was stretched across the path, his dark brown and gold patterns perfectly camouflaged against the fallen leaves and dappled sunlight. Ahmad estimated the pythons weighed over 300 pounds, making this one of the largest specimens he had encountered in his years of guiding. The snake appeared sluggish in the heat, but his head was raised and alert, tongue flicking as he sensed Ahmad's approach. Ahmad had encountered large pythons before and knew they were generally not aggressive toward humans unless threatened or extremely hungry. His usual procedure was to give them a wide berth and to find an alternate route, but the terrain here was too dense for easy detours, and he was eager to complete his survey before dark. Instead of retreating, he decided to encourage the snake to move by prodding it with a long stick, a technique that had worked with smaller pythons in the past. The python's response was immediate and devastating. The moment Ahmad's stick made contact, the massive snake exploded into motion with shocking speed. His enormous head whipped around and struck Ahmad in the chest, knocking him backward off the trail. Before Ahmad could recover, 300 pounds of muscle was wrapping around his body, the python's coils encircling his torso and legs with crushing force that drove the air from his lungs. The attack continued with methodical precision. The python's powerful body dragged Ahmad off the trail into dense undergrowth, where the snake's natural advantages became overwhelming. Ahmad's desperate attempts to reach his radio were cut short as the python's coils tightened around his chest, compressing his ribcage and making breathing impossible. The constriction increased with each of Ahmad's struggles, the snake's muscles responding to movement with increased pressure. Ahmad's ribs cracked audibly under the immense pressure as the python's grip tightened like a living vice. His spine compressed as the snake's coils worked their way around his neck and torso, cutting off blood flow to his brain while simultaneously crushing his internal organs. Within minutes, Ahmad's movement ceased as the massive python's embrace stopped his heart and collapsed his lungs. The consumption process began immediately. The python's jaws unhinged with mechanical precision, stretching impossibly wide as the snake began working Ahmad's body head first into its throat. The process took several hours, the python's elastic gullet expanding to accommodate prey much larger than its head. By dawn, Ahmad had disappeared entirely into the massive snake's digestive system. Ahmad's tour company began searching when he failed to return from his scouting expedition. Search teams found his GPS unit and torn clothing scattered along the trail a week later, but his body was never recovered. Local wildlife officials conducted a brief investigation, ruling his disappearance an occupational hazard of jungle guiding in remote areas. The incident prompted new safety protocols for tour operators in Sarawak, requiring guides to work in pairs when scouting remote areas, and to carry emergency beacons when venturing into unexplored territory. Ahmad's family received compensation from his employer's insurance policy, and a scholarship fund was established in his name for young Malaysians pursuing careers in ecotourism. But even trained researchers weren't immune to the deadly power of these massive constrictors. Dr. Lisa Park's academic pursuit of python behavior in the jungles of Sumatra would lead to an encounter that no amount of education could prepare her for. It was June 22, 2017, and the Indonesian rainforest of Sumatra shimmered in the oppressive tropical heat. Deep in the remote Lucer National Park, where ancient trees towered over a carpet of rotting vegetation and the air buzzed with the constant hum of insects, Dr. Lisa Park moved quietly through the undergrowth with the research equipment. The jungle around her was alive with the calls of gibbons and the rustle of small mammals, but Lisa's attention was focused entirely on tracking the behavior patterns of the forest's most formidable predator. At 28, Lisa was a graduate student in herpetology at the University of California, conducting field research for her PhD dissertation on python hunting behavior. She had been studying in Southeast Asia for 6 months, documenting the feeding patterns and territorial behavior of reticulated pythons in their natural habitat. Her research was groundbreaking, the first comprehensive study of how these massive constrictors adapted their hunting strategies to different prey species and environmental conditions. Lisa's methodology was unconventional and risky. While most researchers studied pythons from a safe distance using camera traps and radio telemetry, she preferred direct observation and hands-on data collection. She worked alone to avoid disturbing the snake's natural behavior, often spending days tracking individual specimens through dense jungle terrain. Her professors had expressed concerns about her methods, but Lisa's preliminary results were so promising that they had approved her continued solo fieldwork. Reticulated pythons in Sumatra grow to enormous sizes due to the abundance of prey and lack of natural predators. These apex constrictors are capable of taking prey as large as sun bears and orangutans, using their incredible strength and patience to ambush victims at water sources and game trails. They're most dangerous when they're hungry or protecting territory, and their feeding cycles can be unpredictable, with some individuals going months between meals before entering aggressive hunting states. That morning, Lisa had discovered what appeared to be the perfect research opportunity: a massive female reticulated python that had recently fed and was resting in a sunny clearing. The snake was enormous, easily 20 feet long and weighing an estimated 280 pounds, her body visibly swollen from a recent meal. Lisa assumed the python would be docile and sluggish after feeding, making this an ideal opportunity to collect measurements and behavioral data without disturbing the animal. Lisa approached the python slowly, her camera and measuring equipment ready, believing the snake's post-feeding state would make her safe to observe at close range. She had studied python behavior extensively and knew that recently fed snakes typically showed little interest in additional prey. But as she moved closer, positioning herself for photographs and measurements, she failed to recognize the subtle signs that this python's feeding was incomplete. The attack was swift and unexpected. The python, still driven by active feeding instincts, struck at Lisa with explosive force when she moved within range. The massive snake's head slammed into her chest, knocking her to the ground as 280 pounds of muscle began wrapping around her body. Lisa's equipment scattered as the python's coils encircled her torso and legs, the snake's grip tightening with each breath she tried to take. The python's powerful body dragged Lisa toward a nearby stream, where the snake could use the water to help manage its oversized prey. Lisa's desperate attempts to reach her radio were cut short as the python's coils compressed her chest, making breathing impossible. The constriction was methodical and relentless, each loop of the snake's body finding purchase around her rib cage and neck. Lisa's ribs cracked under the immense pressure as the python's muscles contracted in powerful waves. The snake's grip became a deadly vice that compressed her chest cavity and cut off blood flow to her brain. Her struggles only triggered the python's instincts to constrict harder, the massive snake responding to movement with increased pressure. Within minutes, Lisa's movement ceased as the python's crushing embrace stopped her heart. The consumption process began in the shallow water, where the python could use buoyancy to help swallow prey much larger than its head. The snake's jaws unhinged with mechanical precision, stretching impossibly wide as it began working Lisa's body into its throat. The process took most of the day, the python's elastic gullet expanding to accommodate its massive meal. Lisa's research team began searching when she failed to return to base camp that evening. They found her waterlogged equipment floating in the stream 2 days later, but her body was never recovered. Local authorities conducted a brief investigation, ruling her disappearance an accident related to dangerous wildlife research. The University of California established new safety protocols requiring all field researchers to work in pairs when studying large predators, and Lisa's preliminary research was published posthumously, contributing valuable data to the scientific understanding of python behavior. Her family established a memorial scholarship for young women pursuing careers in herpetology. But academic researchers aren't the only ones who underestimate these deadly serpents. In the shadowy world of illegal animal trafficking, Carlos Mendez was about to discover that cutting corners with dangerous snakes could have fatal consequences. It was October 12, 2014, and the abandoned warehouse in Miami's industrial district sat silent in the pre-dawn darkness. Inside the cavernous space, rows of makeshift enclosures housed some of the world's most dangerous reptiles, their presence hidden from authorities by layers of false permits and forged documentation. The air was thick with the smell of reptile musk and the constant hum of heating systems, while shadows danced across concrete walls lined with terrariums and snake cages. This was Carlos Mendez's domain, a carefully concealed operation that smuggled exotic animals into the lucrative American black market. At 36, Carlos had been involved in the illegal exotic animal trade for 8 years, building a network of suppliers and buyers that stretched from Miami to New York. His operation specialized in rare and dangerous species that legitimate dealers couldn't or wouldn't handle: venomous snakes, massive constrictors, and protected species that commanded premium prices from wealthy collectors. Carlos had survived numerous close calls with deadly animals, developing a reputation for fearlessness that bordered on recklessness. His overconfidence had grown with each successful deal, leading him to take increasingly dangerous shortcuts. The warehouse held dozens of illegal specimens, but none was more valuable or more dangerous than the massive male African rock python he had recently acquired from a contact in Nigeria. The 18-foot snake was worth over $50,000 to the right buyer, but it had proven to be extremely aggressive and difficult to handle. African rock pythons are among the most aggressive python species in the world, known for their unpredictable temperament and incredible strength. Native to sub-Saharan Africa, they are apex predators capable of taking prey as large as antelopes and young crocodiles. Unlike their more docile Asian cousins, African rock pythons retain their wild instincts even after years in captivity, viewing humans as potential threats or prey. Their constricting power can generate over 100 pounds of pressure per square inch, and their strike speed is faster than most people can react to. That night, Carlos had arranged to deliver the python to a private collector in Orlando who was willing to pay cash with no questions asked. The buyer was scheduled to arrive at dawn, giving Carlos only a few hours to sedate the massive snake and prepare it for transport. To save money and avoid involving additional people in the illegal transaction, Carlos had decided to handle the dangerous procedure alone. Carlos entered the python's enclosure carrying a syringe loaded with veterinary sedative, planning to inject the snake and then transfer it to a shipping container. The 200-pound python was coiled in the corner of its reinforced cage, its dark brown and gold patterns making it nearly invisible in the dim lighting. The snake's head was raised and alert, its muscular body tensed for action. The attack was instantaneous and overwhelming. The moment Carlos stepped within striking range, the massive python launched itself across the enclosure with explosive force. Its enormous head slammed into Carlos's chest, knocking him backward against the cage wall as 200 pounds of muscle began wrapping around his body. The syringe flew from his hand as the python's coils encircled his torso and arms, the snake's grip tightening with crushing force. The constriction was methodical and relentless. The python's powerful body worked in waves, each loop finding purchase around Carlos' ribcage, waist, and neck. Carlos's ribs began cracking under the strain as the snake's muscles contracted in powerful pulses, each squeezed tighter than the last. His desperate struggles only triggered the python's instincts to constrict harder. Carlos's screams echoed through the empty warehouse as the python's grip became a deadly vice that compressed his chest cavity and cut off his air supply. Within minutes, Carlos's movement ceased as the massive python's embrace stopped his heart and collapsed his lungs. Then the consumption process began. The python's jaws unhinged with mechanical precision, stretching impossibly wide as the snake began working Carlos's body head first into its throat. Carlos's business partner discovered the gruesome scene 2 days later when Carlos failed to show up for their planned meeting. The investigation uncovered the entire smuggling operation, leading to multiple arrests and the seizure of dozens of illegal animals. But not all deadly encounters with giant snakes involve illegal activities. In the Florida Everglades, wildlife control specialist Mark Johnson was about to discover that even legitimate python removal could turn deadly when proper precautions were ignored. It was February 14, 2013, and the Florida Everglades stretched endlessly under the pale winter sun. A vast wilderness of sawgrass marshes and cypress swamps that had become ground zero for one of America's most devastating ecological disasters. Deep in the backcountry of the national park, where airboat trails disappeared into maze-like channels and cell phone signals vanished entirely, wildlife control specialist Mark Johnson tracked his most dangerous quarry through the shallow waters and dense vegetation. At 44, Mark had been hunting invasive Burmese pythons in the Everglades for 5 years as part of the state's aggressive removal program. These massive Asian constrictors, originally released or escaped from the exotic pet trade, had established a breeding population that was devastating native wildlife throughout South Florida. Mark took pride in capturing the snakes alive for research purposes rather than killing them outright, believing that studying their behavior patterns could help develop more effective control strategies. Recent months have been difficult for Mark personally. A messy divorce had left him financially strained and emotionally isolated, leading him to take on more dangerous solo assignments to maximize his earnings from the state bounty program. His colleagues had expressed concerns about his increasingly reckless approach to python capture, but Mark's success rate was impressive, and he had developed techniques for single-handedly subduing snakes that most specialists wouldn't attempt without backup. Burmese pythons in the Everglades have grown to enormous sizes due to the subtropical climate and abundant prey. These apex predators have virtually no natural enemies in Florida, allowing them to reach lengths over 20 feet and weights exceeding 250 pounds. Female pythons are particularly dangerous during breeding season, when they become extremely aggressive in defending their nests and territory. Their constricting power can crush the bones of large mammals, and their patient hunting style makes them nearly impossible to detect until they strike. That morning, Mark had received reports of an unusually large python sighting in the remote area of the park where several endangered bird species were nesting. The snake had been spotted by researchers who estimated its length at over 17 feet, making it one of the largest specimens reported in the area. Mark saw this as an opportunity to capture a prize specimen that could provide valuable research data while earning him a substantial bounty payment. Mark tracked the massive female python to a secluded hammock surrounded by shallow water and dense vegetation. The snake was enormous, easily 17 feet long and weighing an estimated 220 pounds, her golden brown patterns perfectly camouflaged against the dry grass and palmetto fronds. She was coiled near what appeared to be a nest site, her massive head raised and alert as she sensed Mark's approach through the swamp. Mark approached the python without proper capture equipment, believing his experience would allow him to subdue her using improvised techniques he had developed over years of solo hunting. He failed to recognize the signs that this was a protective mother defending her nest. The aggressive posturing, the way she tracked his movements, the subtle coiling that preceded a defensive strike. His overconfidence had blinded him to the extreme danger he was walking into. The attack came with devastating swiftness. The protective mother python struck at Mark with explosive force, her massive head slamming into his chest and knocking him backward into the shallow water. Before he could recover, 220 pounds of muscle was wrapping around his body, the snake's coils encircling his torso and legs with crushing force that drove the air from his lungs. The python's powerful body dragged Mark deeper into the swamp, where the snake could use the water and vegetation to help overpower her prey. Mark's desperate attempts to reach its radio were cut short as the python's coils tightened around his chest, compressing his ribcage and making breathing impossible. The constriction increased with each of Mark's struggles, the snake's muscles responding to the movement with increased pressure. Mark's ribs cracked audibly under the immense pressure as the python's grip tightened like a living vice. His spine compressed as the snake's coils worked their way around his neck, cutting off blood flow to his brain while simultaneously crushing his internal organs. The murky swamp water made his struggles even more desperate as he fought against both the python's crushing embrace and the threat of drowning. Within minutes, Mark's movement ceased as the massive python's constriction stopped his heart and collapsed his lungs. The snake maintained her grip for nearly an hour, ensuring her perceived threat was completely neutralized before beginning the slow process of consumption. The python's jaws unhinged with mechanical precision as she began working Mark's body into her throat, using the buoyancy of the water to help swallow prey much larger than her head. Mark's airboat was discovered empty by park rangers several hours later when he failed to check in at his scheduled time. Despite extensive searches involving helicopters, tracking dogs, and dozens of volunteers, his body was never recovered. The massive python had likely consumed him entirely and retreated deeper into the vast swampland, leaving no trace of her victim. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission conducted a thorough investigation, ruling Mark's disappearance an occupational hazard of python removal work in remote areas. New safety protocols were implemented, requiring python hunters to work in pairs and carry emergency beacons when operating in isolated locations. Mark's death sent shockwaves through Florida's python removal community, where he was remembered as skilled but increasingly reckless in his final months. His ex-wife received his life insurance payout, and a memorial fund was established to support the families of wildlife control specialists killed in the line of duty.
Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.